The last thing my history teacher said before we left for summer break was, if you forgot anything in your locker, get it tonight, because the building's getting sealed tomorrow morning. And normally I would have ignored it. But halfway home, I realized my house key was still clipped inside my backpack, hanging in my locker, and my parents were already driving to my aunt's place 2 towns over for the weekend, which meant I either went back for it or spent the night outside my own house. So around 8:40 that night, I rode my bike back to the school while the sky still held a little blue light at the edges. And the parking lot looked wrong immediately because every teacher car was gone except one old silver sedan sitting crooked near the gym entrance with its headlights off. And I remember slowing down because our school was never completely empty during the year. But on the last day, it felt abandoned in a different way, like the building itself had relaxed after everybody left. And when I pulled open the side entrance, the hall lights were already dimmed into nighttime mode, leaving only every third fluorescent panel buzzing overhead, while the rest of the corridor sat in gray shadow. And the sound my shoes made against the tile echoed so far that it almost sounded like somebody else walking a second behind me. And I kept turning around expecting to see another student or a janitor, but there was nobody there, only rows of dark lockers and the faint smell of floor cleaner hanging in the air. And I remember checking my phone because suddenly I didn't want to be inside long. But I had no signal at all, which happened sometimes in parts of the building. So I kept walking toward the sophomore hallway where my locker was, and about halfway there, I heard one locker door slam somewhere in the distance, hard enough to echo through the entire floor, and I stopped immediately because it wasn't subtle. It sounded deliberate, like someone angry. And for a second, I honestly thought maybe another kid had come back for something too, so I called out, "Hello?" And my own voice sounded too loud in the empty hallway, and after a few seconds, a voice answered from somewhere farther down. "Office is closed." It was a man's voice, calm but weirdly flat, and I assumed it was the night custodian until I realized the voice hadn't sounded close enough to belong to someone standing nearby. It sounded like it came through the PA system overhead, except the speakers weren't on. And before I could think about it more, another locker slammed somewhere upstairs, then another, then silence again. And I felt this immediate pressure in my chest, like I was being noticed by the building itself. Which sounds dramatic now, but that's exactly how it felt. Like I'd entered somewhere after hours where I wasn't supposed to be anymore, and I started walking faster until I reached my locker, spun the combination, grabbed my backpack, clipped off the house key, and was already turning away when I noticed something taped to the inside of the locker door that definitely hadn't been there earlier that day. A yellow sticky note, folded in half, with my name written on it in black marker. And I remember staring at it because nobody at school used my full name except teachers. And when I unfolded it, it only said, "Don't stay after the second bell." No explanation, no signature, just that sentence. And underneath it, someone had drawn 3 vertical lines like tally marks, and I stood there trying to think if it was some dumb senior prank. But then the first bell rang somewhere deep in the school, loud and sudden enough to make me physically jump. And the sound echoed forever because the building was empty. And that made no sense because school was closed. And the automatic bell schedule had been turned off for summer already. And for a second, I just stood frozen, staring down the hallway while the ringing faded. And then every fluorescent light above me flickered once at the exact same time. and I heard movement upstairs directly over my head. Not footsteps exactly, more like chairs scraping slowly across tile floors. And that was enough for me to start walking fast toward the exit, but as I passed the stairwell, I heard somebody running up there. Fast, heavy footsteps climbing toward the second floor, and against my better judgment, I glanced through the stairwell window, expecting maybe another student messing around, but the stairs were empty even though the running continued higher and higher until it faded somewhere above the third floor, and then the second bell rang, and the sound hit differently, because this time the hallway lights dimmed halfway through it until the corridor almost went dark, except for emergency lights glowing red near the exits. And I remembered the note instantly. Don't stay after the second bell. And something about the timing of it made my stomach drop, because whoever left that note knew the bells were going to ring, and I started moving faster, almost jogging now. And as I passed classroom 214, I noticed the door was cracked open about an inch, even though every classroom had been locked earlier that day, and inside I could hear whispering, very low and constant, like several people talking at once. And I slowed down because I recognized one of the voices immediately as my friend Tyler's. Except Tyler was at a lake house, 2 hours away by then, because he'd posted pictures already. And I remember standing outside the door listening while the whispers continued in overlapping murmurs. And then clearly, in Tyler's voice, I heard, "He's still here?" Followed by another voice I didn't recognize saying, "Not after the third one." And at that exact moment, the whispering stopped completely, like every person inside the room had turned toward the door together. And I backed away instantly, trying not to make noise. But one of the desks inside scraped sharply across the floor, and suddenly something hit the classroom door hard from the inside, making it swing wider for a second before slowly drifting shut again. And I ran after that, full sprint down the hallway toward the main entrance, while the overhead lights flickered above me one after another. And halfway there, the third bell started ringing. Except it wasn't the normal school bell anymore. It sounded stretched out and distorted, almost metallic, and all the classroom doors along the hallway clicked open at the same time. Not wide, just enough to leave thin black gaps facing the corridor, and every instinct I had told me not to look inside any of them. But I still caught glimpses while running past. Rows of desks facing the walls instead of the front of the room. Chairs stacked upside down in strange patterns. Movement in the corners where nobody should have been. And I reached the main entrance just as the third bell stopped. But the doors wouldn't open, and I slammed into the push bar over and over while panic climbed into my throat because I could hear footsteps behind me now. Slow and synchronized, multiple sets moving together from the far end of the hallway. And when I finally looked back, there was nobody visible yet. But every classroom door was open wider than before, and something about the darkness inside them looked occupied, like the rooms weren't empty anymore. And then over the intercom, a woman's voice calmly said, "Students remaining after dismissal will be remembered." And immediately after that, every locker door in the hallway exploded open at once with a deafening metallic crash. And I don't know how to explain the fear that hit me then, because it wasn't just panic. It felt personal somehow. It was like the building recognized me specifically, and I kept slamming the door until finally it released and burst outward, sending me stumbling onto the front steps. And the second I crossed outside, every light inside the school went completely dark at once, leaving only my reflection staring back at me in the glass entrance doors. except my reflection wasn't moving exactly right. And for half a second, it looked like there were several figures standing behind me inside the school lobby before the darkness swallowed everything completely, and I rode home faster than I ever had in my life. And for weeks afterward, I convinced myself it had been some elaborate senior prank or maintenance issue until August, when our vice principal quietly announced during orientation that the night custodian had retired unexpectedly after an incident during summer shutdown. And when someone asked what happened, she paused too long before saying he'd reported hearing students inside the building after midnight, even though security cameras showed empty hallways. And then she added one thing that made my skin crawl, because she said, "If you ever hear the dismissal bell after hours, leave immediately. Don't wait for another one." And nobody laughed, because somehow every student in the room already looked uncomfortable, like they'd heard rumors before. And that year I noticed something else too. Whenever somebody transferred schools suddenly or stopped showing up after break, people forgot them fast, unnaturally fast, like conversations about them faded halfway through. And one afternoon, while cleaning my room, I found the yellow sticky note from my locker still folded inside my backpack. Except now there were 4 tally marks instead of 3. And underneath them, written in smaller handwriting I swear wasn't there before, it said, "You stayed long enough to hear it remember you." The second story happened the summer after graduation, when my friend Marcus convinced 5 of us to sneak into the old elementary school before demolition because they were tearing it down at the end of June. And everyone in town had stories about the place already because it had been shut for years after water damage supposedly made parts of the building unsafe. But what people really talked about was the old music hallway downstairs where substitute teachers refused to stay alone after dark, and Marcus loved stuff like that. So 2 nights after graduation, we parked behind the baseball field around 11 p.m. and climbed through a broken maintenance gate carrying flashlights and cheap gas station snacks like idiots. And at first, it honestly felt fun, the kind of dumb late-night adventure you think you'll laugh about later, because the building looked small compared to how enormous it felt as kids, and the windows reflected moonlight so brightly they almost looked silver. And we got inside through a side cafeteria door Marcus had pried open earlier that week, and immediately the smell hit us. Old water damage mixed with dust, and something sweeter underneath it, like paper left in heat too long. And our flashlight beams kept catching tiny, floating particles drifting through the halls, while the whole building creaked softly around us. And Jenna kept joking about hearing kids singing, even though there was obviously nothing there. But then, when we reached the first grade corridor, we found tiny, wet footprints crossing the tile floor ahead of us, bare footprints about the size of a child's. And Marcus immediately said they were probably raccoon tracks distorted by water. But they were too clear, perfectly shaped footprints leading down the hallway before disappearing abruptly at the wall. And none of us really talked after that because the mood changed all at once, and we kept hearing distant noises that sounded almost familiar, like pencil tapping or chairs shifting in another room. The kind of sounds schools always make during the day that become terrifying when the building's empty. And eventually we reached the basement stairs leading toward the music rooms. And right away, Jenna said she didn't want to go down because it felt colder near the stairwell. And she was right. The air changed completely there, damp and freezing enough that I could see my breath faintly in the flashlight beam. And Marcus started down first, while the rest of us followed reluctantly. And halfway down, we noticed children's drawings taped all along the wall beside the stairs. Faded construction paper pictures covered in water stains. But the weird thing was they looked new, not dusty or damaged like everything else in the building. And every drawing showed the same thing in different ways. Groups of smiling children standing beside a black doorway with no room around it, just darkness. And I remember one drawing specifically because someone had written "The Quiet Room" above the doorway in uneven crayon letters. And at the bottom, a teacher figure stood outside counting students, while one child inside the dark doorway had no face. And nobody said anything for several seconds after we noticed that because suddenly it didn't feel like exploring anymore, it felt like interrupting something. And then from somewhere below us came the sound of a piano key being pressed once, soft but unmistakable. And Marcus actually laughed nervously and said, "Somebody else must be there." But none of us answered because we all knew the sound had been too deliberate, too isolated. And when we reached the basement hallway, our flashlights revealed old music stands scattered across the floor and water stains running down the walls like dark veins. And farther down the corridor, one classroom door stood slightly open with dim, yellow light glowing inside, even though the building had no power anymore. And every part of me wanted to leave right then, but Marcus started walking toward it, slowly like he was hypnotized, and we followed, because none of us wanted to be left alone in the dark hallway. And as we got closer, we could hear soft humming coming from inside the room, a tune that sounded almost familiar but wrong somehow. And Marcus pushed the door wider, while all of us crowded behind him. And inside the room sat an old upright piano against the wall with a single desk lamp glowing beside it, even though no cord was attached. And the humming stopped immediately when we entered. And I swear the piano bench moved slightly, like someone had just stood up from it. And Jenna whispered, "Did you guys see that?" But nobody answered because we were all staring at the chalkboard behind the piano where someone had written a list of names in fresh white chalk, dozens of them stacked vertically. And at the very bottom was Marcus's name, written smaller than the others like it had just been added. And before anyone could react, the desk lamp clicked off instantly, plunging us into flashlight beams and darkness. And from somewhere deeper in the basement, a school bell rang once, muffled and distant, and then every classroom door along the hallway outside creaked open at the same time. And what scared me most wasn't the sound, it was Marcus's face, because he suddenly looked completely unfocused, staring past us toward the open doorway like he recognized someone standing there. And quietly he said, "She says we're late." And Jenna grabbed his arm, asking who he was talking to. But he pulled away slowly, without looking at her, and started walking into the hallway, while the rest of us shouted at him to stop. And then from every open classroom came humming, the same tune as before, but sung by dozens of quiet voices together. And we ran after Marcus because he kept walking deeper into the basement corridor toward a black door at the very end that none of us remembered seeing earlier. And above it hung a faded sign reading "Quiet Room." And by then all of us were panicking, yelling for Marcus, while the humming got louder around us, but he just kept walking calmly, like he couldn't hear anything else. And when he reached the door, he stopped and said very softly, "They forgot to count me." And before anyone could react, the door behind him opened inward into complete darkness. Not a normal dark room, deeper than that somehow, like the light from our flashlights stopped at the frame itself. And inside we heard children whispering over each other in excited little voices. And Marcus took one step forward before Jenna screamed his name loud enough to echo through the entire basement, and instantly every sound stopped. The humming, the whispers, everything. And Marcus blinked hard like waking from sleep, then looked around confused and terrified, and the black doorway slammed shut so violently the walls shook, and all 6 of us ran without speaking, crashing up the basement stairs and out through the cafeteria exit while alarms suddenly started blaring somewhere inside the building. Even though the electricity supposedly didn't work and none of us stopped running until we reached the parking lot, and after that night Marcus changed in small ways that became harder to ignore over time because he'd forget conversations halfway through them and sometimes pause like he was listening to someone beside him. And once during summer, he asked me if I remembered a girl named Eleanor from our elementary school class. But nobody by that name existed in our yearbook. And when I told him that, he looked genuinely unsettled and said, "Then why do I remember leaving her downstairs?" And the last story happened during my senior year of college, when I stayed on campus 2 extra weeks after finals to work summer maintenance because the pay was decent and most students had already gone home, leaving the dorm buildings nearly empty except for athletes and a few international students. And the campus at night felt completely different during break because without crowds or noise, the old buildings suddenly seemed too large and too quiet, and my job mostly involved checking locked classrooms and reporting damage from before renovation started, which meant walking through empty academic buildings alone after midnight carrying a ring of keys and a clipboard. And for the first few nights it was boring, almost peaceful, until I started noticing the same girl sitting in different buildings after hours, always alone, always facing away from me. And the first time I saw her was in the library around 1 a.m., sitting perfectly still at a corner desk under dim lights while the rest of the floor sat empty. And I almost told her the building was closing until she slowly stood and walked into the shelves without looking at me, disappearing before I reached the aisle, and I assumed she'd left another way until I checked the exits and found every door still alarmed from the inside. And after that, I kept seeing her everywhere, a figure with dark shoulder-length hair, sitting silently in empty lecture halls or at cafeteria tables long after closing hours, never moving until I noticed her, and then always walking away just out of sight. And eventually I asked another maintenance worker named Daniel if students sometimes stayed illegally during summer. And the second I described her, his expression changed because quietly he asked, "Was she facing away from you?" And when I said yes, he nodded once and told me, "Never follow her if she walks downstairs," and I laughed at first because it sounded like a joke. But Daniel didn't smile, he just said seriously, "If she goes downstairs, you leave the building." He signed, and he refused to explain further. And after that, I tried convincing myself the sightings were stress or exhaustion. But then one night, while locking up the humanities building, I heard footsteps following mine 1 floor below me, matching my pace exactly. And every time I stopped, they stopped too. And finally, I leaned over the stair railing expecting another worker, but instead I saw the girl standing motionless on the landing below with her head tilted slightly upward toward me, her face hidden completely by hair. And even from that distance, something about her posture felt deeply wrong, too still, almost mannequin-like. And then slowly she raised one arm and pointed downward toward the basement level, and immediately every light in the stairwell dimmed on its